4 young women vanished from the streets of League City, Texas, between 1983 and 1991. Their bodies were all found in the same desolate field off Calder Road, positioned near trees, left for the elements to claim. Despite decades of investigation, FBI involvement, and advances in DNA technology that finally gave 2 nameless victims their identities back in 2019. No one has ever been convicted of these murders. The killer, or killers, remain free, and the Texas killing fields continue to hold their deadly secrets. On October 7, 1983, 25-year-old Heidi Villarreal Fye finished her shift as a bartender in League City and told coworkers she was heading home. She never arrived. Her 5-year-old daughter waited for a mother who would never return. 6 months later, a family's dog brought home human bones from the woods behind their house. Heidi had been dead the entire time her family searched desperately for her body decomposing in a field less than a mile from where she was last seen alive. The autumn air in League City, Texas, carried the familiar scent of salt water and oil refineries on October 7, 1983. The small town of roughly 30,000 people sat nestled between Houston and Galveston, along Interstate 45. Serving primarily as home to oil workers, port employees, and families seeking affordable living outside the big city, it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where people felt safe. Heidi Villarreal Fye embodied everything vibrant about life in her mid-20s. At 25 years old, she possessed an infectious energy that drew people to her naturally. Her niece, Nina Yeager, would later remember Heidi as someone who acted more like a big sister than an aunt. Always ready with a joke, always making time to play, always making everyone around her feel special and valued. Heidi's laugh could fill a room, friends recalled, and her smile could brighten the darkest days. Being a single mother to a 5-year-old daughter defined Heidi's existence and purpose. Every decision she made, every extra shift she picked up bartending, every sacrifice, it all centered on providing the best possible life for her little girl. Her father adored her with the fierce protectiveness that fathers reserve for their daughters. To him, Heidi was still his baby girl, no matter how grown she became. The bond between them ran deep, built on years of shared laughter, inside jokes, and unwavering mutual support. That Friday evening, Heidi worked her usual shift at the bar, mixing drinks and chatting with regular customers who considered her more friend than server. The atmosphere was typical for a Friday night. People unwinding after long work weeks, music playing from the jukebox, the pleasant buzz of conversation and clinking glasses. Heidi moved through her shift with practiced ease, balancing trays, remembering drink orders, offering warm smiles to everyone who approached the bar. Around closing time, Heidi completed her side work, wiping down the bar, restocking glasses, counting her tips. She said goodnight to coworkers, exchanging the casual pleasantries of people who would see each other again in a day or two. Nobody sensed anything unusual about the evening. Nobody felt any premonition that this goodbye would be permanent. Heidi gathered her belongings, walked out into the October night, and headed toward her car. The drive from the bar to her apartment was short and straightforward, a route Heidi had taken hundreds of times before. In a town the size of League City, nothing was very far from anything else. Most nights, she would be home within 15 minutes, kissing her sleeping daughter on the forehead, maybe watching a little television before bed, planning for the weekend ahead. But sometime between leaving the bar and reaching her apartment, Heidi Villarreal Fye disappeared. When Saturday morning arrived without any word from Heidi, her family's concern began as mild confusion before rapidly escalating into genuine alarm. She wasn't the type to stay out all night without calling. She wasn't the type to leave her daughter worried. Friends tried her apartment, no answer. They drove by. Her car wasn't there. They called everyone they could think of who might have seen her or know where she'd gone. By Sunday, with still no contact, no explanation, no sign of Heidi anywhere, her family walked into the League City Police Department to file a missing persons report. The fluorescent lights of the police station felt harsh and clinical as they explained that Heidi had now been missing for more than 48 hours, that this was completely unlike her, that something must be terribly wrong. The response they received, while polite, carried an undertone of skepticism that would become painfully familiar to families of missing women throughout the 1980s. The officer taking the report asked routine questions. Had there been any arguments at home recently? Did she have a boyfriend? Any financial problems? Drug use? The implication hung unspoken but unmistakable in the air. Young women disappeared by choice all the time. They ran away from responsibilities, from relationships, from ordinary life. They usually turned up in a few days, embarrassed but fine. Heidi's family tried to convey the certainty they felt in their bones. This wasn't a woman running away from anything. She had everything to stay for, especially her daughter. She was happy, stable, responsible. This disappearance made no sense unless something terrible had happened. But they could see in the officers' eyes that their urgency wasn't being matched by the department's response. The report would be filed. They would keep an eye out. But no massive search operation would be launched. No Amber Alert issued. Those didn't exist yet. No assumption that Heidi was in immediate danger. The October days grew shorter as fall deepened toward winter. Heidi's family conducted their own searches, driving through League City streets and surrounding areas, posting homemade flyers on telephone poles and in store windows. Heidi's photo, that brilliant smile, those kind eyes, stared out from hundreds of flyers, asking if anyone had seen her, pleading for information, offering a phone number to call. The family became amateur investigators, talking to Heidi's coworkers, tracing her known hangouts, trying to piece together any clue about what might have happened. Weeks became months. October turned to November, November to December. The holidays arrived with cruel irony, a season meant for family gatherings and celebration, now marked by Heidi's empty chair at the dinner table. Her daughter asked when Mommy would come home. Nobody had answers that wouldn't shatter a 5-year-old's world even more than it had already been shattered. By January 1984, the family had to face the reality that with each passing day, the chances of finding Heidi alive diminished. But they clung to hope because what else could they do? Hope was all that stood between them and the abyss of imagining the worst possible outcomes. Then came April 4th, 1984, a date that would forever divide the family's life into before and after. A family living on Irvin Street in League City owned a dog that roamed their property and the surrounding wooded areas, as many dogs in rural Texas do. That afternoon, the dog trotted home carrying something in its mouth, something that the family initially couldn't quite identify. Upon closer inspection, the horrible truth became clear. The dog had brought home human bones, skeletal remains. The family called 911 immediately, their voices shaking with shock and revulsion. League City Police Department responded with multiple units, cordoning off the wooded area between Irvin Street and Calder Road. Crime scene investigators arrived, along with officers trained in search and recovery. They began a methodical grid search of the woods behind the family's property. Within hours, they located the rest of the skeleton. The remains lay in dense brush and vegetation, partially concealed but not buried. The body had been left exposed to the elements, to wildlife, to time. Advanced decomposition had reduced what was once a vibrant young woman to nothing but bones scattered among the Texas scrub. The Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office took possession of the remains for analysis and identification. Dental records were requested and compared against those of missing persons in the region. The process took days that felt like years to families waiting to know if these were their loved ones. Finally, the confirmation came. The dental records matched Heidi Villarreal Fye. She had been dead for approximately 6 months. Dead the entire time her family searched for her. Dead while they posted flyers and called police stations and drove through streets, hoping for a glimpse of her. She had been less than a mile from where she was last seen, decomposing in that field while life continued around her without anyone knowing she lay there. The medical examiner could not determine a specific cause of death due to the advanced state of skeletal remains and the time that had elapsed. There were no obvious fractures or trauma visible on the bones, but soft tissue injuries would have decomposed long ago. She could have been strangled, suffocated, or killed in any number of ways that left no mark on bone. The manner of death was ruled a homicide based on circumstances, but the exact method remained unknown. Crime scene technicians processed the site where Heidi was found, looking for any evidence the killer might have left behind. But 6 months of exposure to rain, wind, sun, and wildlife had obliterated most physical evidence. No clothing was found with the body. No identification, no murder weapon, no obvious clues pointing investigators toward a suspect. Whoever had killed Heidi Fye knew what they were doing. The choice of location, a remote field off a little-traveled road, suggested someone familiar with the area, someone who knew this spot would provide time for decomposition to destroy evidence. The fact that the body was left supine, not buried, indicated the killer wanted it found eventually, but not immediately. There was a calculated quality to it, a cold assessment of risk versus reward that spoke of planning rather than impulse. The investigation began in earnest, with detectives interviewing everyone who had been at the bar the night Heidi disappeared. Everyone who knew her, everyone who might have seen something unusual. They traced her movements that final evening, trying to pinpoint exactly when and where she'd been taken. Had someone grabbed her in the parking lot, followed her from the bar, encountered her somewhere along the route home? Nobody had witnessed anything suspicious. Nobody remembered seeing Heidi after she left work. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the October night, only to rematerialize as bones in a field 6 months later. The funeral for Heidi Fye brought together everyone whose lives she had touched. The church overflowed with mourners, family, friends, co-workers, people from the community who had never met Heidi, but felt compelled to pay respects to a life cut short so brutally. Her 5-year-old daughter, too young to fully comprehend the finality of death, sat confused about why everyone was crying, why Mommy was in a box, why they were saying she'd never come home again. Heidi's father stood at the casket with tears streaming down his face, one hand pressed against the polished wood as if he could somehow reach through and touch his daughter one last time. The vibrant, laughing young woman who had lit up every room she entered was gone forever, reduced to memories and photographs and a terrible unanswered question. Who had taken her from them? As Heidi was laid to rest in a League City cemetery, investigators continued working the case, determined to find justice for her and answers for her family. They believed they were dealing with an isolated incident. A tragic murder, certainly, but not part of any larger pattern. The field where Heidi died would be cataloged, photographed, and eventually released back to nature. becoming once again just another patch of Texas scrubland. But the killer was watching. And the killer wasn't finished with that field. Heidi Fye would not be the last young woman to die there. The Texas killing fields had claimed its first known victim, and a terrible pattern was about to emerge, though it would be years before anyone realized what was happening. The summer of 1984 arrived with oppressive heat and humidity, typical of southeast Texas, where the Gulf of Mexico keeps temperatures high and the air thick enough to chew. League City tried to move forward from the horror of Heidi Fye's murder, though the case remained open and active. Her family continued to grieve, to seek answers, to wonder if justice would ever be served. Nobody yet suspected that another young woman's fate was already set in motion. Nobody knew that the field off Calder Road would soon claim another life. September would bring a new nightmare, and a grieving father's journey that would span decades and ultimately save hundreds of lives. September 10th, 1984, dawned bright and clear in League City, the kind of early fall day when summer's oppressive heat finally begins to loosen its grip on Texas. For the Miller family, the day represented new beginnings. They had just moved to League City from another part of Texas, settling into a new home, starting fresh in a new community. It was meant to be an opportunity for a better life, especially for their 16-year-old daughter, Laura. Laura Miller carried herself with the poise of someone older than her 16 years, forced to mature quickly by circumstances that would have broken many teenagers. She possessed genuine musical talent, a beautiful singing voice that brought joy to everyone who heard it. Her father, Tim Miller, remembered her as creative and sensitive, someone who felt things deeply and expressed those feelings through music and art. Laura's dreams revolved around performing, maybe joining a band, maybe going professional someday, maybe just bringing happiness to people through song. But Laura's young life had been marked by challenges that tested her strength daily. Beginning that year, she had started experiencing severe epileptic seizures, debilitating episodes that struck without warning, leaving her disoriented and exhausted. The seizures made her feel different from other teenagers at a time when fitting in felt like everything. They forced her to miss school, to drop out of the choir she loved, to explain constantly to new people why she sometimes needed special accommodations. The move to League City in September 1984 represented hope for Laura, a chance to start over at a new school where nobody knew about her medical issues, where she could try to feel normal again. The family's new house sat in a quiet residential area, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes and families waved to each other from front porches. It felt safe, welcoming, like a place where they could finally settle down and stop worrying so much. But the phone company's installation schedule hadn't aligned with their move-in date. On September 10th, the family's phone service had not yet been connected. Laura wanted to call her boyfriend, just to let him know they'd arrived safely, that she was okay, that she was thinking of him. It was a simple, innocent request, the kind teenagers make dozens of times without anyone giving it a second thought. Laura's mother agreed to drive her to a payphone located about half a mile from their new home. It was a short drive on a pleasant afternoon. Laura promised she would walk straight back after making her call. 20 minutes, tops. Her mother watched as Laura approached the payphone, receiver in hand, and began dialing. Everything seemed normal, safe, ordinary. "I'll be home in 20 minutes," Laura called out, waving to her mother before the car pulled away. Those were the last words Laura Miller ever spoke to her family. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. When Laura's parents and boyfriend arrived at the house expecting to find her there, they instead found an empty home and a growing sense of dread. Tim Miller immediately drove back to the payphone. The receiver hung on its metal cord, swaying slightly in the breeze. No sign of Laura. No indication of where she might have gone. He traced the route she should have walked. A straightforward half-mile journey along residential streets in broad daylight. Nothing. He knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen a teenage girl with long hair walking by. Nobody had noticed anything unusual. It was as if Laura had completed her phone call and then simply ceased to exist. By evening, the Miller family sat in the League City Police Department, filling out a missing persons report, experiencing the same frustrating response that Heidi Fye's family had received almost exactly 1 year earlier. The officer taking the report was polite but skeptical. 16-year-old girls ran away all the time, he explained. They got upset about moving to a new town, about leaving friends behind, about restrictions their parents imposed. Had there been any arguments recently? Any reason Laura might want to disappear for a while? Tim Miller tried to explain about Laura's epilepsy, about her need for medication, about how she would never just leave without telling anyone. But he could see the officer wasn't fully convinced. The report was filed. They'd keep an eye out. But the unspoken message was clear. Wait a few days. She'll probably call home once she cools off. But Tim Miller knew his daughter. He knew this wasn't a runaway situation. And as hours turned into days with no contact, no sightings, no explanations, he knew something terrible had happened to Laura. Sleep became impossible. Tim spent his nights lying awake, his mind racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. During the day, he drove through League City streets searching for any sign of his daughter. He created flyers with Laura's photograph and personal details, posting them on every telephone pole, in every store window, anywhere people might see them. He contacted local media, begging them to run stories about Laura's disappearance. He organized volunteer search parties, coordinating groups to comb through parks, vacant lots, wooded areas, anywhere a teenager might be. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture. Every phone call made Tim's heart leap. Maybe this was Laura. Maybe she was calling to say she was okay. Every knock on the door brought momentary hope. Maybe this was a police officer with good news. But each time, the hope collapsed back into despair. No news, no leads, no Laura. Tim began researching similar cases in the Houston area, looking for patterns that might help him understand what could have happened. He discovered Heidi Fye's case, another young woman from League City who had vanished without a trace, whose body had been found in a field off Calder Road just months earlier. The similarities were striking and terrifying. Both were from League City. Both had disappeared without witnesses. Both had been found dead. Could there be a connection? Tim brought his concerns to the police, but they told him not to jump to conclusions. Heidi Fye had been 25 years old, a bartender who worked nights. Laura was 16, a high school student who disappeared in the afternoon. The circumstances were different enough that investigators weren't ready to link the cases. But Tim's instincts told him otherwise. He began his own investigation, talking to people who had known Heidi, trying to find any possible connection between her and Laura. He drove out to the field where Heidi's body had been found, walking through the tall grass and brush, trying to understand why someone would choose this particular spot as a dumping ground. Months crawled by with agonizing slowness. Fall turned to winter. The holidays arrived without Laura. Thanksgiving with an empty chair at the table, Christmas presents that would never be opened, a New Year that brought no resolution. Laura's seizure medication sat untouched in the medicine cabinet, a heartbreaking reminder that wherever she was, She wasn't getting the medical care she needed to survive. Tim Miller's life became consumed by the search for his daughter. His marriage suffered under the strain. His work suffered. Everything suffered. But he couldn't stop searching. Couldn't accept that Laura was just gone forever. Couldn't give up hope even as that hope grew thinner with each passing day. I knew in my heart that Laura wasn't coming home alive, Tim would later say. But I was afraid she was never going to be located. The year 1985 passed without answers. Then 1986 arrived, and with it came a discovery that would shatter the Miller family while confirming Tim's worst fears. February the 1986 brought cold temperatures unusual for southeast Texas, where winter rarely means more than needing a light jacket. Two young boys rode their bicycles through the field off Calder Road that afternoon, following trails they'd made during countless previous adventures in this area that felt like their own secret world. The abandoned oil field offered a sense of freedom and exploration, away from adult supervision. A place where kids could be kids, without anyone telling them to be careful or come inside. But on this particular day, their childhood adventure ended abruptly when they came across something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Partially concealed in the brush near a tree, they found human remains, skeletal remains. A body that had been lying in this field for months. The boys immediately rode to the nearest house and called 911. Their voices shaking with shock and fear. League City Police Department responded with multiple units, cordoning off the area and beginning a methodical crime scene investigation. Detectives who had worked Heidi Fye's case 17 months earlier felt a sickening sense of déjà vu as they processed this new scene in the same field where Heidi had been found. But as crime scene technicians expanded their search grid, they made a discovery even more chilling than finding one body. There was a second set of remains nearby, also positioned near a tree, also partially hidden by vegetation. Two bodies, in the same field, found together. The realization hit investigators like a physical blow. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was using this field as a dumping ground. The Texas killing fields had claimed not just one victim, but multiple victims. League City was dealing with something far worse than isolated murders. They potentially had a serial killer on their hands. The Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office was called in to process both sets of remains and attempt identification. Both bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition, having been exposed to Texas weather, wildlife, and the passage of time. One set of remains appeared to have been there longer than the other, suggesting the killer had returned to this same location at different times. Dental records provided the key to identifying one victim relatively quickly. Laura Miller, the 16-year-old who had disappeared 17 months earlier after walking from a payphone toward home. The confirmation devastated the Miller family, but also validated Tim's instincts that something terrible had happened to his daughter. She hadn't run away. She had been murdered and left in that field while her father drove past it hundreds of times searching for her. I had driven past that field countless times looking for Laura, Tim would say years later, his voice still breaking with emotion. She was there the whole time, and I didn't know it. I drove right past her. The second set of remains could not be immediately identified. The medical examiner compared dental records against missing persons reports from across Texas and neighboring states, but no matches came up. Without any way to put a name to the remains, the medical examiner's office designated her as Jane Doe, a placeholder name for a woman whose identity had been stripped away along with her life. What could be determined about Jane Doe was limited but tragic. The medical examiner estimated she had been between 28 and 32 years old at the time of death. She had been shot in the back with a small caliber weapon, a gunshot that severed her spine. Evidence suggested she had also been beaten, with several ribs showing signs of trauma. But without a name, without anyone reporting her missing, without any leads to her identity, Jane Doe remained a mystery. One of the nameless dead whose life seemed to matter to no one. The discovery of Laura Miller's body and the unidentified Jane Doe transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a potential serial murder investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to create a profile of the possible killer or killers. The profile suggested someone who knew the area intimately. The field off Calder Road wasn't a place you stumbled upon by accident. It was remote, accessible only by poorly maintained dirt roads that saw little traffic. The killer had to know it would take time for bodies to be discovered there, had to be confident in their ability to return without being seen. This strongly suggested someone local, someone who had lived in League City or the surrounding area for years, someone who might even be part of the community, hiding in plain sight. Laura Miller's funeral brought together hundreds of mourners, family, friends, classmates, community members who had never met Laura, but felt compelled to honor a life cut short so brutally. The service was held at a local funeral home, with standing room only as people packed in to pay their respects. Photographs of Laura lined the walls, Laura singing in choir, Laura laughing with friends, Laura as a child with her parents. These images showed a vibrant teenager full of dreams and potential, making her senseless murder even more incomprehensible. Tim Miller stood at his daughter's casket, one hand resting on the polished wood, tears streaming down his face as he said goodbye to the little girl who had brought so much joy into his life. Laura had been Daddy's girl, and now she was gone forever. The pain was so intense it felt physical, like something vital had been ripped out of his chest, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. But even in the depths of his grief, something began to crystallize in Tim's mind. Laura's case had been mishandled from the beginning. Police had dismissed her as a runaway instead of treating her disappearance as the emergency it was. Valuable time had been lost. Evidence had gone cold. If law enforcement wouldn't prioritize missing persons cases with the urgency they deserved, then Tim would do it himself. At Laura's graveside service, as her casket was lowered into the ground, Tim Miller made a silent promise to his daughter. He would dedicate the rest of his life to finding missing people, to ensuring that no other family would endure what the Millers had endured. Laura's death would not be in vain. It would become the catalyst for saving others. This promise would eventually lead Tim Miller to found Texas EquiSearch, a nonprofit search and recovery organization that would go on to help find more than 250 missing people around the world. But in February 1986, as he stood over his daughter's grave, Tim could think of only one thing: finding whoever had killed Laura and left her in that field. The investigation intensified following the discovery of the two bodies. League City Police Department worked around the clock, interviewing hundreds of people, following every possible lead, compiling thick case files that grew larger by the day. The FBI brought in additional resources, including forensic experts and investigators experienced in serial murder cases. But despite the massive effort, despite thousands of man-hours and extensive forensic analysis, the case remained frustratingly cold. There were no witnesses to any of the disappearances, no physical evidence linking anyone to the crimes, no confessions, no arrests. The community of League City lived under a cloud of fear. Parents kept closer watch on their daughters. Women were warned not to walk alone, especially at night. The field off Calder Road became known as a place of death, somewhere to avoid, a landmark that represented every parent's worst nightmare. And still, the killer remained at large, free to strike again if they chose. The question haunting everyone involved in the investigation was simple, yet terrifying. Would there be more victims? The answer came 5 years later. The years between 1986 and 1991 passed slowly for those connected to the Killingfields cases. Tim Miller threw himself into organizing search efforts for other missing persons, channeling his grief into action, determined to help other families find the answers he had been forced to wait so long to receive. The field off Calder Road sat quiet during those years, gradually being reclaimed by nature. The crime scene tape long since removed, the area returning to its former state of desolate abandonment. But the field had not given up all its secrets. On September 8, 1991, two people riding horses through the area made the discovery everyone had been dreading: another body. The fourth victim was found in circumstances eerily similar to the previous three, lying supine, not buried, positioned near vegetation that partially concealed the remains. Advanced decomposition made immediate identification impossible, just as it had with Jane Doe 5 years earlier. League City detectives returned to process yet another crime scene in the now infamous Killingfields. They photographed, measured, collected evidence, and worked with the medical examiner's office to try to determine the victim's identity. But despite checking missing persons databases and comparing dental records, they could not put a name to these remains. She was designated Janet Doe, becoming the second nameless victim found in that field. And for nearly 28 years, that's how she would be known. Just another Jane, another forgotten woman, another unsolved mystery. The discovery of a fourth body confirmed what investigators had feared. They were dealing with a serial killer who had used this same location multiple times over nearly a decade. 4 women, Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Jane Doe, and now Janet Doe, all found dead in the same remote field. The pattern was unmistakable, even if the perpetrator remained unknown. But patterns are only useful if they lead somewhere. And despite the FBI's involvement, despite years of investigation and countless leads pursued, the Calder Road cases remained cold. The case files grew thicker with witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative notes, but no closer to identifying the killer or killers responsible. The families of the victims lived in a special kind of limbo. Tim Miller continued his search and recovery work, finding some measure of purpose in helping others, while the question of who killed Laura remained unanswered. Heidi Fye's family grieved privately, holding vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance, keeping her memory alive even as justice remained elusive and somewhere. The families of Jane Doe and Janet Doe went about their lives not knowing that their loved ones were among the dead in a Texas field, not knowing that investigators were trying desperately to identify them and bring them home. Decades passed. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The case files on the Killingfields murders gathered dust in the League City Police Department's archives. Detectives retired and were replaced by new investigators who inherited these cold cases, along with the responsibility of never giving up on them. The field itself was gradually surrounded by development as League City grew from a small town into a suburban community. What had once been desolate countryside was now bordered by residential neighborhoods, churches, and businesses. But the families never forgot, and neither did law enforcement. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: genetic genealogy, the same DNA technology that had been used to identify and capture the Golden State Killer and solve other decades-old cold cases. Investigators worked with DNA analysis laboratories and genealogical researchers to build family trees based on DNA extracted from the remains of Jane Doe and Janet Doe. The process was painstaking, involving months of work comparing DNA profiles against public genealogy databases, tracing family lines, and contacting potential relatives. On April 14, 2019, League City Police Department held a press conference that would finally restore the identities of two nameless victims who had been known only as Jane and Janet Doe. For decades, Jane Doe was identified as Audrey Lee Cook, born November 25, 1955, in Memphis, Tennessee. She had been approximately 30 years old when she was murdered in late 1985 or early 1986, matching the medical examiner's original age estimate. Audrey had moved to the Houston area looking for a fresh start, working as a mechanic and trying to build a new life for herself. Janet Doe was identified as Donna Prudhomme, a young woman from Louisiana who had also been living in the Houston area at the time of her disappearance. Like Audrey, Donna had been trying to make a life for herself, working odd jobs and hoping for better days ahead. These women were not just Jane and Janet Doe anymore. League City Police Chief Gary Ratliff told the assembled media, "They were daughters. They were friends. They were people with lives and stories that deserved to be told. They deserved to have their names back." The identifications were bittersweet for Audrey's and Donna's families. Relief that their loved ones were no longer nameless, that their stories would finally be told, that they could finally be properly mourned. But also renewed pain, because the identifications confirmed what they had probably known in their hearts for years. Their daughters were never coming home. Audrey Lee Cook had last been heard from in late December 1985. Associates told investigators she may have been involved in cocaine sales and use, a detail that raised questions about whether the drug world had played a role in these murders. Audrey had worked for several companies in the Houston area, including as a mechanic for a golf cart company, at Harrison Equipment Corporation, and at National Rent-A-Car. She had moved to Texas with a girlfriend, both of them looking to start fresh in a new place. When Audrey's family, living out of state, hadn't heard from her in months, they had traveled to Houston to search for her. But they found no trace. Audrey had simply vanished. They filed a missing persons report, but without any leads or evidence of foul play, the case went nowhere. Eventually, heartbroken and frustrated, the family had to return home without answers, left to wonder for more than 3 decades what had happened to Audrey. Now, finally, they knew. Audrey had been murdered and left in that field, her body discovered in 1986 but remaining unidentified until advanced DNA technology could give her name back. Donna Prudhomme's story was similarly tragic. She had been living in the Port Arthur area of southeast Texas, struggling with her own challenges, trying to make a life for herself in difficult circumstances. When she vanished, no one immediately reported her missing. A heartbreaking reality for many marginalized individuals who fall through society's cracks. Donna became one of the forgotten, the overlooked, the type of victim that predators throughout history have targeted because they know society won't look too hard for them. But now, finally, Donna was no longer forgotten. She had her name back. Her family could finally know what happened to her and give her a proper burial. The identifications opened new investigative avenues for League City PD and the FBI. Now that they knew who the victims were, they could trace their final days, interview people who knew them, look for connections that might lead to the killer. Were Audrey and Donna connected to each other in some way? Did they know Heidi Fye or Laura Miller? Was there one person who knew all 4 women? Or had the killers simply targeted vulnerable women who wouldn't be immediately missed? These were questions that still needed answers. But at least now, investigators had names to work with instead of just case numbers for Jane and Janet Doe. Over the 4 decades since Heidi Fye disappeared in 1983, numerous suspects have emerged in the Texas killing fields cases. Some have been definitively ruled out through alibis, DNA evidence, or other means. Others remain persons of interest, forever under the shadow of suspicion, but never charged due to lack of concrete evidence linking them to the murders. One name that surfaces repeatedly in discussions of the killing fields is Clyde Hedrick, a local construction worker who had connections to the area and knew at least one woman who died under suspicious circumstances near the field. On July 29, 1985, a 29-year-old woman named Ellen Ray Simpson Beeson was last seen with friends at a bar called the Texas Moon Club in League City. She met Hedrick that evening, and they made plans to go swimming together. Her partially mummified remains were later discovered underneath a sofa in a wooded area beside Old Causeway Road in Galveston County. Not in the Calder Road field, but close enough geographically to raise questions about possible connections. When Beeson's remains were exhumed in 2012 for further forensic analysis, the medical examiner determined she had suffered several severe skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. In 2014, Hedrick was convicted of manslaughter in Ellen Ray Beeson's death and sentenced to prison. But he was never charged with any of the 4 Calder Road murders, despite extensive investigation into his possible involvement. Hedrick has maintained his innocence in those cases, and investigators have never gathered enough evidence to bring charges against him. Another suspect who dominated headlines in the 1990s was Robert Abel, a former NASA engineer who owned property near the killing fields. Abel became the focus of intense investigation and public scrutiny, with some law enforcement officials convinced he was responsible for the murders. Tim Miller and others who knew Abel personally believed strongly in his innocence, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted based on circumstantial evidence and proximity rather than concrete facts. Abel maintained his innocence until his death in 2005, and no physical evidence ever linked him to the crimes. Many who followed the case closely believe Abel was an innocent man whose life was destroyed by false accusations, a cautionary tale about rush to judgment in high-profile cases. After years of being publicly named as the prime suspect, after having his property searched multiple times, after enduring the suspicion and hostility of his community, Abel died without ever being charged, much less convicted. The truth is that despite decades of investigation, countless interviews, extensive forensic analysis, and the combined efforts of local, state, and federal law enforcement, no one has ever been arrested or charged with the 4 Calder Road murders that define the Texas killing fields. The case remains open, and League City Police Department continues to investigate every lead that comes in, no matter how cold the trail may seem. FBI Special Agent Richard Renison, who grew up in the League City area and began his law enforcement career with League City PD in 1993, became the FBI's case agent for the Killing Fields murders in 2005. For Renison, the cases carry intense personal significance. These were crimes that happened in his hometown, affecting his community, leaving wounds that never fully healed. The fact that the offender chose this area gives us a couple of tidbits of insight. Renison explained in an FBI interview years later. It's such a remote, rural area. Somebody had to know about that place. It wasn't somewhere you just happened upon. You had to know the field was there, know it was isolated, no bodies could be hidden there without immediate discovery. The FBI's behavioral analysis suggests the killer is likely male, familiar with the League City area, and possibly still living in the region. The choice of location, returning to the same field multiple times over nearly a decade, indicates significant comfort level with the area and confidence that he wouldn't be caught. This suggests either someone who lived nearby or someone whose work or regular activities took them through that area frequently enough to know its isolated nature. What we're looking for is anomalies that exist between all four girls, Renison continued. If there's one person that knew all the girls, or one person that was seen with multiple victims, that would be a significant lead for us. But anything that anybody in the public knows, anything no matter how small they think it is, we really want them to come forward because it may be very significant to us, even though they think it's just a minor detail. But as years pass, cold cases become exponentially harder to solve. Memories fade, witnesses die, evidence degrades. The families who have spent decades seeking justice are aging, some passing away without ever knowing who killed their loved ones. The Texas killing fields has been the site of more than just these 4 murders. More than 30 bodies have been found in the general area since the 1970s, though many of those cases have been solved and linked to different perpetrators. Some were solved through advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy. William Lewis Reese, for example, was convicted in 2022 of killing 3 young women in the area in the 1990s. 12-year-old Laura Smither, 20-year-old Kelly Cox, and 17-year-old Jessica Kane. Reese's convictions brought long-awaited justice for those families, proving that even decades-old cases could be solved with persistence and advancing technology. But the 4 original Calder Road murders, Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Cook, and Donna Prudhomme, remain unsolved. The central question haunting investigators is whether one person killed all 4 women, or whether the field's reputation attracted multiple killers over the years who used it for the same grim purpose. To date, the signs point to one killer, although multiple killers can't be ruled out, the FBI has stated publicly. Given the nature of the area where the bodies were found, it was likely someone with roots in the area, someone who knew the field well enough to feel confident using it multiple times. The advancement of genetic genealogy that identified Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme has given investigators renewed hope that the same technology might eventually identify their killer. If that person's DNA is in the system, or if family members have uploaded DNA to public genealogy databases. But as of 2025, more than 40 years after Heidi Fye disappeared, the cases remain unsolved and the killer unpunished. On October 7th, 2023, exactly 40 years after Heidi Fye disappeared, her family held a vigil at the field where she was found. Nina Yeager, Heidi's niece, who was just a small child when her aunt was murdered, organized the gathering at 3535 Calder Road behind Magnolia Creek Baptist Church, which now sits near the site that was once simply known as the Killing Fields. She didn't deserve what happened to her, Yeager told the assembled crowd as the sun began to set. None of these girls did. The vigil honored all 4 women whose bodies were found in the field. Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Cook, and Donna Prudhomme. Families, friends, law enforcement officers, and community members gathered as darkness fell, lighting candles and sharing memories of women who had been gone for decades but were far from forgotten. The flickering candlelight created a solemn atmosphere, transforming the ordinary field into a place of remembrance and continued grief. Tim Miller attended, as he has attended countless vigils and memorials over the years. Now in his 70s, Miller has devoted more than 4 decades of his life to searching for missing people. What began as one grieving father's desperate attempt to find meaning in senseless tragedy evolved into Texas Equa Search, a non-profit search and recovery organization that has helped find more than 250 bodies and recovered living missing people around the world. Helping families with a missing loved one became my life's work, Miller reflected at the vigil. I couldn't save Laura. But maybe I could help save someone else, or at least give other families the answers they deserve, even if those answers aren't what they hope for. Texas EquuSearch operates on donations and volunteer labor, deploying search teams equipped with specialized equipment, sonar, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, drones, boats, anywhere they're needed. The organization has assisted in searches across the United States and internationally, bringing closure to families facing the same nightmare Tim Miller endured when Laura vanished. Miller's work has brought him into contact with hundreds of families, going through their own desperate searches for missing loved ones. He understands their pain in ways most people can't. The sleepless nights, the false hope, the soul-crushing moment when you find out your loved one is never coming home. The anger at a system that doesn't always prioritize missing persons cases with appropriate urgency. But finding other missing people hasn't healed the wound left by Laura's murder. Nothing can. The Texas killing fields took his daughter, and no amount of time or good works will bring her back. Tim still thinks about Laura every single day, wondering what kind of woman she would have become, what grandchildren he might have had, all the moments they should have shared that were stolen by a killer who has never been held accountable. For the families of Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, the 2019 identifications brought both relief and renewed agony. Relief that their loved ones were no longer nameless, that their stories would be told, that they mattered enough for investigators to never give up on identifying them, but also pain because the identifications confirmed what they had probably suspected for years: their daughters were never coming home, and someone had taken them and thrown them away like garbage. The League City community has lived with the shadow of the killing fields for more than 4 decades. The area has been partially developed. Businesses have moved in. Churches have been built. Residential neighborhoods have sprung up around what was once desolate field, but the memories remain embedded in the community's collective consciousness. Parents still warn their children about talking to strangers. Women still feel a chill when driving down Calder Road after dark. The name Killing Fields is still spoken in hushed tones, a reminder that monsters are real and sometimes they live among us, undetected and unpunished. League City Police Department keeps the case files active and accessible. New detectives are briefed on the cases as part of their orientation. Every technological advance in forensic science is evaluated for potential application to the killing fields evidence. DNA samples are periodically retested as technology improves. The department's website maintains dedicated pages for each victim, with photographs, timelines, and information, pleading for anyone with knowledge to come forward. FBI Special Agent Richard Renison, who has worked the case longer than almost anyone else in law enforcement, refuses to give up even as the decades pile up without resolution. With that much time going by, people lose their memories, he acknowledged in a recent interview. People pass away. People just simply forget. It's hard to remember significant details from that long ago, but someone out there knows something. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Maybe they didn't think it was important at the time, or maybe they were scared to come forward. But I'm asking them, begging them, to come forward now. It's never too late to do the right thing. The field itself looks peaceful in the daylight these days. The tall grass sways in the Gulf breeze. Birds sing in the scattered trees. Nothing about it suggests the horror that unfolded there between 1983 and 1991. But those who know its history see something different when they look at it. They see 4 young women who never got to finish their stories. They see families who never got full closure. They see a killer who got away with murder. Memorial markers have been placed near the site. simple but poignant reminders of the lives lost. Flowers are left there regularly, especially on anniversaries of the victims' disappearances or birthdays. The families haven't forgotten. League City hasn't forgotten. Law enforcement hasn't forgotten. And somewhere, the killer knows that too. Whether they're still alive, still living in the area, still watching news reports about the cases they committed decades ago, or whether they've died, taking their secrets to the grave. They know that their crimes will never be forgotten, never be dismissed, never be written off as solved just because time has passed. 42 years after Heidi Fye disappeared on that October night in 1983, fundamental questions about the Texas Killing Fields murders remain unanswered. These questions haunt not just the families of victims and the investigators who dedicated years to the cases, but anyone who has ever wondered how such evil could exist and go unpunished in a civilized society. Why did the killer choose that particular field off Calder Road? Was it simply proximity and convenience? A remote location they happened to know about from living or working in the area? Or did the location hold some deeper significance? Some meaning that made it more than just a convenient dumping ground? Did the killer work nearby? Perhaps at one of the oil fields that once dotted the landscape? Did they live close enough to visit the site repeatedly without arousing suspicion? Or was the field chosen precisely because it was associated with oil work, a place where a vehicle's presence would seem normal and unremarkable? How many victims are there, really? The 4 Calder Road bodies, Heidi, Laura, Audrey, and Donna, are the cases most directly linked and investigated as a potential series. But with more than 30 bodies found in the broader Killing Fields area over the decades, could some of those also be connected to the same perpetrator? Were there other victims who were never found, whose remains lie somewhere in that vast expanse of Texas scrubland, whose families still believe they simply ran away or started a new life somewhere else? Is the killer still alive? If the murders began in 1983, when the perpetrator was likely in their 20s or 30s, they would be in their 60s or 70s today, if they're still living. Have they stopped killing? Moved away to another state, perhaps continuing their crimes elsewhere? Died, taking their secrets and guilt to the grave? Or are they still in League City, living an ordinary life on the surface while carrying the weight of 4 murders in their conscience? If they possess any conscience at all, the behavioral profile suggests someone who knew the area intimately, someone local or with deep ties to League City and the surrounding region. This raises the disturbing possibility that the killer might still be part of the community, perhaps even known to the families of victims. Perhaps someone who has attended the vigils and memorials while secretly knowing they're responsible for the deaths being mourned. Some investigators believe the killer stopped, either died, was incarcerated for another crime, moved away, or simply aged out of their murderous impulses. Others believe they may have continued killing elsewhere, selecting victims whose disappearances wouldn't be immediately linked to the League City cases. The possibility that the Killing Fields perpetrator committed murders in other jurisdictions has led to comparisons with unsolved cases throughout Texas and neighboring states, though no definitive connections have been established. The families ask different, more personal questions that cut deeper than investigative theories. Did their daughters suffer? How long were they alive after being taken? Were they alone when they died? Or were other victims held at the same time? Did they call out for help that never came? Did they think about home, about the people who loved them in their final moments? These are questions that may never be answered. They're the kind of questions that torment a parent's mind at 3 a.m., that turn every anniversary into another day of torment. that transform holidays into reminders of absence rather than celebrations of presence. But the families keep asking them anyway. Because the alternative, silence, forgetting, moving on, feels like a betrayal of their daughter's memories. Another question that haunts investigators: what connections existed between the four victims? On the surface, they seem to have little in common. Heidi Fye was 25, a bartender and mother working to support her daughter. Laura Miller was 16, a high school student with musical talent and medical challenges. Audrey Cook was 30, a mechanic who may have been involved in drug sales. Donna Prudhomme was a young woman struggling to make a life for herself. Different ages, different backgrounds, different life circumstances, yet somehow they all ended up dead in the same field. Was there one person who knew all four women? Perhaps a customer at the bar where Heidi worked? Someone Laura encountered on her walk home from the payphone? A drug connection for Audrey? Someone Donna trusted enough to get into a vehicle with? Or were they all simply vulnerable women who crossed paths with a predator who selected them opportunistically? The FBI has stated that finding any common connection between all four victims would be a major break in the case. But despite decades of investigation and thousands of interviews, no such connection has been definitively established. Some theories suggest the killer may have worked in a profession that brought them into contact with many people. A taxi driver, delivery person, security guard, tow truck operator. Someone whose vehicle's presence wouldn't raise suspicion and who had legitimate reasons to interact with women throughout League City. Others speculate the killer may have used a ruse, perhaps posing as police or offering roadside assistance, to gain victims' trust before abducting them. But these remain theories without evidence to support them. The truth is that after more than 4 decades, after tens of thousands of investigative hours, after the involvement of local police, state agencies, and the FBI, the Texas Killingfields murders remain stubbornly unsolved. The advancement of forensic technology offers some hope. DNA analysis has improved dramatically since the 1980s. Genetic genealogy, the technique that identified Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, continues to solve cold cases that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Every year brings new tools, new techniques, new possibilities for breakthroughs in old cases. But technology can only help if there's evidence to test and databases to compare against. If the killer never left DNA at the crime scenes, or if they've never been arrested and entered into the criminal DNA database, or if their family members haven't uploaded DNA to genealogy websites, then even the most advanced technology won't lead to identification. This is the frustrating reality of cold case work. Sometimes you have all the determination, resources, and technology in the world, but without that one crucial piece of evidence or that one witness willing to come forward, the case remains frozen in time. As the sun sets over League City on yet another day without answers, the field off Calder Road settles into quiet darkness. The wind whispers through the grass that has grown over the sites where 4 women's bodies were found decades ago. The area looks peaceful, almost serene, giving no hint of the horror that unfolded here. But peace is an illusion when justice remains unserved. Inside the League City Police Department, case files bearing the names Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Cook, and Donna Prudhomme sit in file cabinets, ready to be pulled out whenever a new lead emerges or a detective needs to refresh their memory of details from decades ago. These files represent hundreds of thousands of hours of investigative work. Interviews, forensic reports, witness statements, theories pursued and discarded, leads that seemed promising but led nowhere. Lieutenant Michael Bluffington, who oversees cold case investigations for League City PD, expressed the department's continuing commitment in 2019. We want to complete the investigation. At this time, we really just want to focus on these girls, who they were, the people who knew them, keeping their memories alive while pursuing every possible avenue to identify their killer. Because that's what this story is really about. Not just cold case file numbers or true crime mysteries or statistics about unsolved murders. It's about 4 real women whose lives mattered, whose deaths left holes in their families that can never be filled, whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. Heidi Fye, who lit up every room she entered with her infectious laugh and her kind heart, who loved her 5-year-old daughter with every fiber of her being, who worked hard to provide a good life for her child. Heidi, who deserved to watch her daughter grow up, to become a grandmother someday, to live the full life that was stolen from her at age 25. Laura Miller, the talented musician with dreams of performing, who fought through medical challenges with courage and determination, whose sensitivity and creativity made her special to everyone who knew her. Laura, who deserved to finish high school, to pursue her musical dreams, to experience all the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that make up a human life. Laura, who was only 16 when someone decided her life was worth less than nothing. Audrey Cook, who moved to Texas looking for a fresh start, who worked as a mechanic and carved out a life for herself despite challenges, who deserved the chance to build something better, to find happiness, to grow old. Audrey, who lay nameless for 33 years before genetic genealogy gave her identity back, who spent more than 3 decades as just Jane Doe before investigators restored her name and her story. Donna Prudhomme, who struggled but kept trying, who was living in the Houston area hoping for better days ahead, whose life may have been difficult but was still valuable, still meaningful, still worth living. Donna, who also spent nearly 28 years as Janet Doe before DNA technology allowed her to be properly identified and mourned by family who had wondered for decades what happened to her. 4 women, 4 lives, 4 families forever changed, 4 unsolved murders that continue to demand justice. Tim Miller continues his work with Texas EquiSearch, knowing that every missing person he helps find is another family spared some of the agony his family endured. He has attended hundreds of funerals, delivered countless bodies to grieving families, provided closure that is painful but necessary. Each search reminds him of Laura, of the desperate weeks and months when he didn't know where she was or what had happened to her, of the small hope that maybe she was still alive somewhere that died the day her body was found. I'll never stop looking for missing people, Miller says. And I'll never stop hoping that someday someone will come forward with information about who killed Laura and the other girls. That person is out there. They know what happened. And I'm praying they'll find the courage to finally tell the truth. The families of all 4 victims gather periodically for vigils and memorials, bonded by shared tragedy and a common desire for justice. They light candles on anniversaries. They share memories of their daughters at community events. They speak to reporters, keeping the cases in the public eye, hoping that constant attention will eventually pressure someone to come forward with information. And they wait. They wait for that phone call from police saying there's been a breakthrough. They wait for advances in technology that might provide new ways to solve old crimes. They wait for someone's conscience to finally overwhelm their fear or loyalty or whatever has kept them silent for decades. Waiting is the hardest part. Waiting without knowing if answers will ever come. Waiting while aging, while friends and family members pass away without ever knowing the truth. Waiting while the killer, if still alive, goes about their life unpunished, knowing they got away with murder. But giving up is not an option. Forgetting is not acceptable. Moving on without justice would dishonor the memories of Heidi, Laura, Audrey, and Donna. So the families keep vigil. The investigators keep working. The community keeps remembering. And the hope, however fragile, however tested by time, persists. Because somewhere, someone knows what happened in that field between 1983 and 1991. Someone knows who killed these 4 women. Someone knows where the evidence is hidden. Someone knows the truth. Maybe it's the killer themselves, carrying that burden of guilt every single day. Maybe it's someone who was told about the crimes, who helped dispose of evidence, who provided an alibi. Maybe it's someone who saw something suspicious that day, something that didn't make sense then, but makes horrible sense now. Maybe it's someone who overheard a confession, who found something incriminating, who has carried the secret for decades out of fear or misguided loyalty. Whoever you are, wherever you are, the families and investigators are pleading with you. Come forward. Tell what you know. Help bring justice for 4 women who deserved so much better than to die in that field and have their killer walk free for more than 4 decades. It's never too late to do the right thing. It's never too late for truth. It's never too late for justice. The Texas killing field still sits there, just off Calder Road in League City, partially hidden by new development, but still visible to those who know where to look. Drive past it today and you might not notice anything unusual. Just another patch of Texas scrubland, unremarkable and easily overlooked. But stop. Get out of your car. Stand there for a moment in the quiet. Listen to the wind moving through the grass, carrying whispers of the past. Feel the weight of what happened in this place. The lives that ended here. The families whose hearts broke here. And remember the names. Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Cook, Donna Prudhomme. They were there. They died there. And they will never be forgotten. Someone knows what happened. Someone knows who did this. And maybe, just maybe, today is the day that person finally decides to tell the truth, to lift the burden they've carried, to help give 4 families the justice they've waited decades to receive. The Texas killing fields is waiting. The families are waiting. Justice is waiting. How much longer will it have to wait?